Hi, welcome back to another video essay. Since second round of midterms is finally over and I'm officially on spring break, finally have time to do things outside of school. Literally amazing. So with the couple days I have at home, I thought that, I should try to pump out another video essay because I've actually been wanting to talk about this particular medium of art for a while because I find it really particularly interesting, and I wanted to talk about this certain artist, Judith Scott, for a while because I find her backstory and her art so intricate and so interesting. It really sucks because I genuinely struggle to find free time, like just maybe even half an hour for leisure reading or like a book I want to read, because I genuinely have no time. So obviously I don't really have time to pump these videos out as much as I would like. So I'm gonna try to maximize this spring break and the very short week that I've been given to make at least two or three. Two is my least, like minimum, and then three is going to be if I'm gonna be efficient as fuck this break. Which I really hope so because I actually have a lot of topics I want to talk about on this channel. So I've been wanting to make a video on textile art for a really long time because I don't know, it's just a medium that I find really interesting, and this one artist in particular, Judith Scott, I find her backstory so mesmerizing, so inspiring, and her work so captivating. So, naturally I thought, of course I have to make a video on this. So as opposed to fine art, textile art is defined as this process of creating using fibers such as sourced from plants, insects, animals, or other synthetic materials. And I would say textile art has been the backbone of human life as early as civilization began because it is one of the oldest art practices out there. And even though there aren't really practical underpinnings to their origins, they kind of just inevitably morphed into the secondary function as in the past as symbols of status or power and beauty, as is all art. The imagery and symbolism is very dependent on the culture and time period that it would be made, but the common thread of artistry and skill, and I guess the process of weaving it together, is something I would say stays constant no matter what time period. So textile art has been used for political expressions in the past and means of communication and self-expression in kind of this three-dimensional way that fine art or painting and two-dimensional mediums don't really have to offer. For example, for so many centuries, art meant the mastery of a particular skill or style or discipline, but I would say this definitely changed or did a 180 in the 19th century when art, this term, actually began to be associated with something that was more so intended for display rather than mastery of a skill. And I would say the idea of textile art is very parallel and similar to that. Textile art is very fluid in a sense that it's very inseparable from the practical use of textiles that we usually see, like in clothes or home comfort. But in textile art, or more recent examples, it has no direct purpose. It serves no human function or for us to use. In a historical context, I would say it's very difficult to separate the learned skills and craft that are associated with the manufacture of textile art, especially since it's always been the woman at home who were working at the loom or were weaving or were producing clothes for her family, or working as seamstresses. So I would say it's very interesting to me historically in the context that it's always been this singular gender dominated field in the past. Even now, it's pretty rare to see male textile artists who have made it pretty far because, again, it still is a very female dominated art medium. And this is interesting to think about in like this historical context. So, Judith Scott was, I would say, a relatively modern contemporary textile artist who kind of was is one of the leading figures in this outsider art movement. So, Judith Scott was actually born in 1943, and she was born to a middle-class family in Cincinnati, Ohio, and was actually born a fraternal twin, and has a fraternal twin sister named Joyce Scott. Joyce describes the pair's early years as basically like inseparable. They would absolutely do everything together. One would not go a place without the other being there, and they would basically spend the entirety of their time together. But as the years passed, differences in their development kind of began to manifest. When Joyce actually began speaking and forming words at the normal age children usually do, Judith actually didn't. It wasn't until many years later that the reason for this inability to find a voice would be diagnosed, but at the time, Judith had been left profoundly deaf by a bout of scarlet fever in infancy. With her deafness at this time, unfortunately though, undiagnosed, Judith actually failed to qualify for the only public school class for children with learning disabilities in her town at the time. It is a very highly likely and most likely the case that in hindsight she just wasn't even able to hear the questions that were being asked to her because she was literally deaf, but nobody around her knew that. Unfortunately, no one around her in her life knew it at the time though, and the entry test was failed, and it was kind of deemed as evidence that Judith Scott was considered retarded and was deemed to be uneducable. In 1950, Judith's parents made the unfortunate decision to send her to the Ohio State ward, and she ended up miserably spending the very early years of her young adulthood with little comfort or proper care for her undiagnosed disabilities. It is very much arguably the severe stigma and inhumane handling of the mentally disabled in the mid-century America that had the most profound impact on Scott's early life. She spent almost 4 years institutionalized before medical advances and more enlightened models of family integration for disabled persons were made, or such places and treatments were out there in the open. So after those 4 decades Judith spent in the ward, Joyce obviously grew up, and after some time and heavy family dispute, Joyce actually took Judith under her care as a legal guardian and decided to enroll Judith at the Creative Growth Art Center in Oakland as a means of occupying her time. Creative Growth was a visionary art center where people with mental or psychological difficulties were given this total artistic freedom. So since Joyce was working full-time, she had her own personal matters to deal with, she didn't really have a lot of time to take care of Judith, so Judith basically spent the majority of her time here. So for nearly 2 years, Judith was very unresponsive to all the activities that the center had her do. She didn't really seem to enjoy painting or sculpture or sewing. But after those couple years, she actually took a fiber arts workshop with the textile artist Sylvia 70. And this basically is the turning point of her life and the start of her artistic career. Finally, Judith had discovered something that she had loved, and what's more, she discovered that she had an innate talent for. So she started off by spontaneously wrapping these pieces of wood in fiber or fabric or threads, and from these were produced her earliest pieces, which are still referred to today as totems. From then on, she did not stop creating. She was constantly in that center making these fiber pieces. And her process was described to be very erratic and instinctive. Like, she didn't really have a formal step-by-step method of her process of creation, and it seemed very instinctive and very on the spot when she was making these. Judith would wrap thread and yarn around everything that she could get her hands on. She would use magazines, chairs, and I think in one piece even a bicycle wheel. So this medium and form of art quickly became a source of communication for Judith, considering the fact that she was verbally and socially blocked for the majority of her life. Tom DeMaria, the director of creative growth, actually believed that she was finally learning to speak, and a lot of people and her family, including Joyce, actually consider these earlier pieces of her art as her first words. So Judith Scott was labeled as an outsider artist because she never really received any formal training and was only taught how to work with these fibers later in her life. I personally don't really like that label and choose to reject it because kind of like the weird stigma that the title brings upon, kind of like this idea that you need formal training or you need this specific background or upbringing to be considered a very famous artist or have any influence in the art world. So that's a term that I don't really like outsider artist, but she is a leading revolutionist in the outsider art movement. Although I don't really like the term, I do agree that it correctly intends to celebrate the barriers that Scott kind of had to overcome to work in this fine art environment. Her cocoon-like constructions usually begin with an object trouvé, which, like I said, could be anything: an umbrella, a skateboard, a tree branch, sometimes even her own jewelry, around which she wound very intricate layers and layers and layers of yarn, twine, and strips of textile until the item's identity was completely obscured and you could not tell what it was. I think her works are so minimalist in so many ways and very present in this non-narrative way that kind of has a strength personally for me. They kind of have like this type of refusal to them, and much like other minimalist work, they stop you from storytelling. You kind of have to focus on what's there, what's in the present, and you kind of, have to walk around it and see its actual type of materiality without the presence of a narrative. In the physical aspects, I love how strongly intricate Scott's work is. I love the complexity of how she loops and forms these trouvailles together, and the way she enmeshes them, I think, is so beautiful. The color palette she uses is very open. You don't really get the feeling that there's a design aspect to her work at all. For me, they kind of trigger this very particular idea of painting and color theory and how things sit and how color kind of speaks for itself. Her gift was obviously automatically recognized and encouraged by the staff, and Judith was given complete free reign over the studio. No object was out of bounds for her, and she would actually work on pieces for days, weeks, and sometimes even months. As her work process went on, she became more and more focused and wouldn't allow for any interruption or distraction from her artwork. And she also became a lot more discerning in her selection of threads and yarns and the shades of the yarn as time went on. Although she never spoke with actual words, Scott's color choices, textures, and the clear emotional ties that she had to her art communicate that in her own language. Not only was she uncovering this long hidden talent, Judith was actually uncovering herself. Having found a voice, she became more confident, and actually a staff at the Growth Center and Joyce herself comment that she began experimenting with her own clothes and wearing more extravagant pieces and accessories and actually starting to express herself. Her work cycle was defined as very constant. She would work 5 days a week for 18 years, and in this time period, she actually produced over 200 of these cocoon-like sculptures. Her work is absolutely an abstract reflection of her own life, and I would say it's kind of like this combination of, her idolized childhood, her loneliness and isolation that she felt in the ward as a young adult, and the connection that she has with her twin sister Joyce. And there is this one specific piece, although all of her pieces are untitled because Judith never decided to title them, of it is widely believed that this piece is to represent two twins reaching out to one another. Judith's work is not really autobiographical in a traditional sense, but they are able to embody kind of this alternate language and this very extra linguistic way of conveying her emotion and outwardly describing who she actually is. Scott was able to pave a path for neurodivergent artists being appreciated on their own terms. Her complex practice prompted art institutions to reevaluate art as a tool for survival and connection, and today her work resides in museums worldwide. Each piece that she would create kind of carried this palpable charge generated by her very intensive generative act of wrapping around a singular object. And although it was not directly influenced by or related to any cultural traditions, her works very resonate uncannily with a range of material culture that involve this intentional accretion for the purpose of healing in very historical and old practices. Judith also actually became the first ever artist with Down syndrome to be featured in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Her work can actually still be seen in permanent collections in New York City, Paris, and London as well. Judith unfortunately passed away in 2005, living 61 years, and she was said to have died in the arms of her twin sister, Judith Scott. Over her lifetime, creating over 200 of these pieces of textile art, varying in textures and sizes and colors, she is solely remembered today for her identity as not a woman with Down syndrome and deafness, but her life as an artist and a textile artist. Her sculptures made of found and personal objects wrapped in these yarns and cocoons of textile exude a sense of mystery, not only through their visual appeal, but also through what they are able to conceal. Drawing on her experiences from her childhood, much of Scott's art reflects on her mistreatment and society's inability to understand her and her life treated as an outcast. However, her art also strove to incorporate her liveliness and her joy and her life and parts of her life that actually were full of love. With a very open-minded and accepting audience, her sculptures bring peace and comfort and inspiration to those who look at it. With an open-minded and accepting audience, her sculptures are able to bring peace and comfort and inspiration to those. Through art, Scott was able to redefine her terms of life and unintentionally discover parts of herself in the creative process. Rather than confining herself to expectations of others, Judith Scott, I think, so impressively defied all of these odds and ended up being one of the most well-known textile artists of the 20th century. I think textile art for me is something that I really personally want to get into. I really want to learn how to weave. I think that would be such a useful skill to have, not only artistically but also functionally, like I said in the beginning of the video. It's just that looms are so expensive, and also I live in a tiny 5 foot by 5 foot square room with two other people because I'm literally in college. There's no way a loom is going to fit in my college dorm, but it definitely is a pipe dream to own a loom and learn how to weave and become really good at it. So yeah, that is my video on why I'm personally so intrigued by textile art and the wonderful and beautiful life and creations of Judith Scott. Thank you so much for watching another video on this channel. I hope that you took something from this, you learned something from it, and whatever you take from this video, I hope that you do very big things with or choose to redefine your life with as Judith Scott did. Make sure you watch for my second video this week because I will be making another one. Maybe 3, maybe 4, who knows. Maybe I'll be really productive this spring break and pump out as many as I can. Bye! Thank you so much for watching!